Okay, welcome everyone to Policy Exchange. Thanks for coming here, and sorry for the slightly late start. I'm Blair Gibbs, I'm the head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. Today's debate is the first in a series of debates looking at issues affecting the mayoral election in May next year, and obviously quite timely now to be discussing the Met Commissioner and the future of the Met Police. We learned yesterday from the Mayor that the announcement of the new Commissioner will happen as early as Monday. We've had an interest in policing in London for some time. 2005 we published something called Manifesto for the Met, which was at the time quite a bold document arguing for stronger accountability to the Mayor of London, for the Met to learn some of the lessons of successful crime reduction in New York and devolving responsibilities to local commanders, and for the Met to become more of a local police force for London, divesting itself of some of its national responsibilities. Now, 6 years later, actually, some of those arguments are all still quite live. But of course, there's a new urgency now. Recent events around phone hacking, corruption allegations, questions of leadership in the Met have all made, I think, the Met's future quite a pressing issue. What it does, how it runs, who it answers to. One of the changes that has happened in 6 years is that the Mayor has been given more power. And as we go on to discuss some of the challenges today, I think one question might be whether the Commissioner of the Met, whether it can be led as an organisation successfully by someone who effectively has two masters. Can the Met be a local force for London and the national force in all that name that it is? The Home Secretary wants a single-minded crime fighter, but what sort of leader does an organisation of 52,000 people actually need? So, to debate these and other questions, we've got a panel today of people who I've described as perhaps two outsiders and two former insiders. In no particular order, firstly, the outsiders. Sir Simon Jenkins, as you know, is a columnist and commentator of The Guardian and Evening Standard and chair of the National Trust, described the Met as a state security force, not a London police force, in his Evening Standard column. And this week it was the latest to urge fresh leadership for the Met from the outside in the shape of Bill Bratton. Tony Travers is visiting professor at the LSE, written extensively on issues affecting governance in London and public services. In 2009, he said that the police accountability in London is a mess. On to those who have an insider perspective, although both now free to speak their mind. Bob Crick, QPM, was Assistant Commissioner until 2009, heading up specialist operations and counter-terrorism. Before that, he was Chief of Surrey and before that, detective in the Met. He now runs Blue Light Solutions, a policing consultancy firm. And lastly, of course, Jackie Smith, former Labour Home Secretary. She was Home Secretary when Surrey and Blair resigned as Met Commissioner and is now a broadcaster and commentator. We'll go straight into the debate. We'll ask each of the panelists to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. The hashtag for this event on Twitter is #PXMetPolice. We have a couple of questions from Twitter coming in as well, but I'll pass straight over to Tony to get us started.
Right, thank you very much, and good afternoon. As has just been said, Metropolitan Police has been much in the news recently, little of it for particularly good reasons. The relationship between the Metropolitan Police and the Conservative Party, when the current majority party in the government was in opposition, problems at News International, civil disturbances, and of course now the spending cuts and other things besides. It's not been a brilliant time, and of course there has been a succession of commissioners in a very short time. So, in my view, the key challenges that now face the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner include the need to show that there is someone in charge who can effectively manage a vast, conservative, with a small c, organisation at a time of considerable political and economic pressure. And this, I think, hints at what is the biggest challenge facing the new Commissioner, and indeed, to some extent, facing politicians in all parties, which is accountability, the way in which the Metropolitan Police are accountable and are held to account. But this is an issue made more complicated by the fact that the Metropolitan Police, we all know this, is simultaneously London's local city police force and also the national police force for a significant array of extremely important activities. And this undoubtedly contributes to a duality in the Commissioner's role, which I think is pretty difficult. Accountability for the police in London at present is a dog's breakfast. The Home Secretary appoints the Commissioner, the Queen actually, formally, on the Home Secretary's advice. Though we've now discovered at the Mayor's pleasure. So there's really three people involved in this relationship, as someone once said, the Queen, the Home Secretary and the Mayor. The Mayor sets the budget for the Metropolitan Police, although of course central government heavily constrains that, so there are two parties in that as well. Currently, though this will change, the Metropolitan Police Authority is accountable for non-operational activity and to some extent to hold the Commissioner and the police to account, but it's pretty complicated and an oddly designed committee by any standards. And of course the Commissioner makes all operational decisions. So this is a very complicated thing, even to study it here and now, certainly I think for the public to make sense of. So, I think it's fair to say that in England and Wales, in the United Kingdom more generally, there has been long-term and overwhelming support for the Commissioner or the Chief Constable in other parts of the country having operational independence. This is seen as axiomatic in British politics. But I think there's a problem in this these days. And that is, this was a system that probably worked very well when authority was powerful, when people were prepared to accept a senior chief officer, a senior police officer, or a chief constable's decisions as being the interpretation of the law. But attitudes to authority have changed, and now, I would argue, no one really stands behind the operational decisions of the Chief Constable, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, in this operational activity. And that is a serious difficulty. There is no, in effect, there's no local electoral legitimacy. So although Chief Constables may be, most of them are, visibly non-political, though they do occasionally, in some cases, let their views slip, but leave that to one side, it's not terribly practical. And the riots actually showed this in this issue very clearly. Because just after the riots had occurred, politicians, notably Boris Johnson, the Mayor, but also Ed Miliband, not exactly in charge of any aspect of British government politics, were to some extent booed on the streets. Obviously responsible for his own party, I mean, you know what I mean, not actually executive responsible, were booed on the streets because people thought politicians hadn't got a grip of what had happened. After the riots had been stopped and sorted out, senior police officers, notably Sir Hugh Ward, claimed credit for stopping them. Now there's an asymmetry here. The public wanted the politicians to do something, the police didn't say it was their fault, but after the riots, undoubtedly the police claimed credit for having stopped them. There is an asymmetry there, and it was very clearly on display. So I think the challenge for the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, the new one, is how to obtain the Mayor's legitimacy in London for their operational activities. How might we find a way forward here? Well, some way needs to be found that gives the Mayor, and politicians perhaps in other parts of the country as well, mayors where they become available in other parts of the country, at least the power to set an overall, a strategic operational policing plan that might include views about patrolling, use of technology, stop and search, whatever the powers are. The Mayor would have to set those headline operational expectations, but of course leaving the Commissioner to make hour-by-hour decisions about how such a plan is actually implemented. This is not unique to London. The issue is a key challenge, I think, for policing across the country, and it needs to be addressed. And the question is simply how to back police operations with the legitimacy of political power. And that, I think, is the key challenge for the next Commission.
Thanks, John.
Blair, thank you. I wanted my 5 minutes to sort of romp through the challenges as I see them under 7 headings. And the 7 headings are crime, confidence and cash, politicians, people, partners and events. Let's be quite clear, the success of the Commissioner, both in the eyes of the people of London and of those to whom he will be accountable, will be in terms of his ability to be able to reduce crime. So to that extent, I think Theresa May was right in focusing on a strong crime fighter, but of course the role is far more complex than that. Even within crime, of course, not only the level being reduced, but the ability to be able to respond to new forms of crime that might emerge, to be able to deal with the whole breadth of crime for which the Met has responsibility will be an important factor. And I just note that Bernard Hogan Howe, for example, and his successor John Murphy in Merseyside have been particularly effective at both dealing with low-level crime and the serious and organised crime that will also, I think the government is right to focus on becoming increasingly important. Secondly, the area of confidence, and there's a whole range of issues here. Undoubtedly, it is the case, given the way in which the last commissioner and his assistant commissioners resigned, that there is a big job to be done in rebuilding confidence in the leadership of the Met, that they have their relationships across the partners that they deal with, and including the press, right. Secondly, I think following the riots, there is a job of reassurance to be done amongst the people of London that the Met are part of understanding the reason why those happened, and would in the future perhaps be more nimble at both the strategic and the tactical decisions necessary in order to prevent that from happening. But I also think there's a very big job to be done in terms of the role of the Met in building confidence in communities. And I suppose I would say this because although, of course, the last government is accused of encumbering the police force with too many targets, I, of course, removed all central targets for the police, apart from the target of raising confidence in people locally that the police were addressing the issues that mattered to them. And if the police is to be both legitimate and if they are to build the supporting communities necessary to enable them to do their job, I think that that focus was right. I regret the fact that this government removed that target, and I think it drove and should drive some of the local accountability that will be made even more difficult by the weakening of safer neighbourhood teams. That's important in local communities and in terms of the way that Londoners feel about the Met. Cash, it goes without saying that the new commissioner will be operating at a time when they will be having to make strategic decisions about where savings are going to be made. You know, it was a bit of a mantra of the last government that we were engaged, or we aim to be engaged, in investment and reform. The challenge for the new commissioner is to be engaged in cuts and reform. And perhaps, you know, the interesting work published this week by Policy Exchange gives some of the breadth of the challenge of reform that I think is necessary if you're not simply going to salami slice the service, but you're actually going to continue to deliver the visibility, the reassurance and the service that Londoners need and deserve. Let me move on to the first of my P's, politicians. If I were to write my memoirs, there would be a few pages devoted to my relationship with Boris Johnson. There would be a section on one of the highlights of my political career when I sat with him in a room and interviewed the candidates for the commissioner last time, and we agreed that Sir Paul Stevenson would be the right candidate. But there would be a focus on not just the personality difficulties that I suppose Boris and I had, but as Tony has described it, the nature of the relationship that has now been set up around the commissioner. Any future commissioner needs to, you know, never mind formal forms of accountability, needs to be able to work both with the Home Secretary with responsibility for those national elements of the job, and increasingly, because of, even if it's not explicit power, the sort of negative power in many ways that the mayor is able to operate with the mayor as well. And at a point at which the mayor appears to be making a plank of his re-election campaign a disagreement with the government about the scale of cuts that might be faced in London, that relationship becomes even more tricky. And I wrote recently about this quite serious mistake that I think that the Home Secretary made in attempting during the course of the riots to act as if it were either possible or desirable for her to be able to issue orders about those things that are clearly operational considerations for the police officers. Never mind that we fell out with Sir Hugh Ward about it. At a point at which I think this distinction between the strategic political accountability that is rightly part of the role of the Home Secretary or any other politician, and the operational independence that is absolutely crucial for police chiefs, at the point at which that is so potentially toxic, not least given, I think today, almost certainly votes in the House of Lords about elected police commissioners everywhere else. That, I think, was a bad mistake in muddying the water of police accountability, and it will make that relationship with politicians even more difficult for the Commissioner in the future. Obviously, the Met Commissioner manages an enormous staff, an enormous number of people. This brings me to my second P. They manage officers facing in the future the impact of not only cuts but also winter reforms and their concerns around what Hutton means for them. They manage them at a point at which, however much Blair and Policy Exchange's report, rightly in my view, argues for greater civilianisation of roles in order to focus police officers on what they're able best to do, at a point at which inevitably it will be the police staff and those providing those support roles and civilian roles who will be the ones who will be facing redundancy. That makes that whole task of managing what is I don't believe that they're totally demoralised staff, but I think given everything that's going on around them, there is a difficult job to be done there. That makes that increasingly difficult. When it comes to partners, policing has to be a responsibility and a task that involves a whole range of different partners across the public sector, and you need to be somebody, in my view, who can work across the criminal justice system, who can work with other leaders of public services across London, increasing with the voluntary sector and with community organisations and the voices and representatives of communities who will be so crucial to help to rebuild some of that confidence that has been hit. And finally, one of the most difficult elements, I think, of being the Met Commissioner is the extent to which events will impact on both your success and potentially, as we've seen, your ability to be able to stay in the job. It will only take a, heaven forbid, successful terror attack for there to be a big need to shift both emphasis and priorities around. It will only need a controversial inquiry along the lines of Cash for Honours or the inquiry that Bob and I remember so clearly involving the arrest of Damien Green, in order for there to be a very big impact on the ability of the Commissioner to be able to manage in the way in which he would want to. And of course, looming next year is the whole issue of the Olympics. Given this context and given these challenges, I'm not at all surprised that so many very well qualified senior police officers across the country decided not to apply for this job. I very much hope that the successful candidate, despite those challenges, is able to make a success of it.
Next up, Bob.
Good afternoon. Well, I left the Metropolitan Police just over 2 years ago, and of course have watched with interest recent developments. Clearly the Met's had a few bruising years, seemingly rolling from one controversy to another. And anyone that's been in policing might say, well, actually that is the nature of the job. But clearly some of those, or many of those controversies have had a bit of a political flavour, and certainly I would echo the points made by Tony about accountability. I certainly felt the heat of political controversy, as Jackie has indicated, in the case when an MP was arrested. Of course, that was in the days when it was as fashionable than it is today. However, what I would say is the next Commissioner, clearly in the light of recent events, will be very focused, I think, on the relationship of the organisation with other parts of the establishment machinery. Some of that machinery is under huge scrutiny, including the Met, and I think that will be foremost in his mind, and obviously it sounds as though it will be in looking at the first steps in stamping his authority on the organisation in terms of standards, transparency, accountability and style. In my 32 years of policing, I witnessed with almost monotonous regularity things going round in circles, successive debates on the effectiveness of the police and the criminal justice system, various corruption scandals. I heard many Home Secretaries pledge that they would cut bureaucracy, I think starting with Merlin Rees just about the time I joined and following on from that. And I think police officers recognise these things are not new, and I think the new Commissioner will recognise these are not new issues. But what I would say is that there is a sense that they have become much more serious and intense in a very short space of time. The rioting that we saw in England over the summer was truly frightening in its ferocity, the speed with which it spread, and perhaps most of all, the very low apparent threshold at which very large numbers of people were prepared to engage in very brazen looting and extreme violence. The police have also got to implement some very serious cuts to their budget. The Met is a very big organisation, but nevertheless those cuts are enormous in terms of the previous experience of the police and the Metropolitan Police. And it is against a backdrop of rising demand, increasing risks and increasing complexity. The backdrop, I think, will be the Commissioner will be very keen to emphasise, actually, despite some setbacks, despite the context that this new post holder comes into the job, it's really important to recognise that the Metropolitan Police and indeed police forces in the UK at the front line do a fantastic job and remarkably remain largely unarmed in a fairly high crime, very liberal Western democracy. That is very unusual, and therefore we mustn't lose sight of the fundamentals, and I think that will be a message that he will want to endorse. Despite some of those setbacks, Scotland Yard, Metropolitan Police is a brand and a reputation that is revered around the world as an organisation that actually produces very good and impressive results with enormous restraint. And therefore, I think the next Commissioner will face two very big issues. One is about the use of force, because of course in the light of the riots, we've seen this call for very robust policing. And I think robust policing in the wake of the riots may yesterday have been police brutality. And I think there is a lack of consistency across our society in terms of expectations about the police and robust policing. And I think to some degree there has been an emasculation of the police. The clinical application of scrutiny to police officers when they are under enormous stress dealing with violent situations and public disorder, the clinical application of the law to people under stress who will make mistakes has, I think, in the past at times been inappropriate. Not always, because we know police officers are human beings and sometimes they cross the line and they have to face the consequences. But it's very unhelpful when the line keeps moving, and it does keep moving, and we do need more consensus and more consistency from the media, from politicians, from commentators about where those lines ought to be drawn, because it's almost impossible, I think, for a police service to operate effectively in that context. I think the second thing that will be enormously challenging for the next Commissioner is the need to manage the budget cuts in a way that protects services and overall policing capability. 20% is a big number against a backdrop of rising demand, expectation and threat. And I think the question on my mind, and I'm sure will be on the next Commissioner's mind, is how do you manage that? Because we've just seen the Metropolitan Police having to mobilise 16,000 officers and have them on duty round the clock, and then replaced by another 16,000 that take over on the next shift. That's unprecedented. So when you look at efficiency, the issue and challenge that will be faced is how can the police, the Metropolitan Police, perhaps implement things like, for example, the armed services, who over time become much less reliant on sheer numbers, yet have packed more of a punch than they did when they had many more fighting personnel. I think the British Army was about 300,000 strong in 1962, it's about 100,000 strong now, but it packs more of a punch. How have they done that? They have transformed the organisations, the armed services. So the question will be, can the police service transform when the issue of officer numbers is so politically charged and so sensitive? And that, I think, given what we've witnessed with the riots and the need to mobilise huge numbers, is a very vexed question. And I think the Commissioner will be looking for support if there is this absolute demand politically for the police to be more efficient. Then there has to be moral and political courage to drive through those reforms. And I think the Commissioner will look and test the support that is available to support him doing that. Finally, I'll just say around the criminal justice system, I think the public want to hear police leaders speak, particularly in London. They want to hear from the Commissioner. But I think in recent years, when senior police officers have made public comment about things they know a great deal about, they have often been accused of acting politically. And I think it's important for the police to enter this debate very publicly. I think the criminal justice system is under huge scrutiny right now. I think arguably one could say it's neither fish nor fowl. We haven't got a ruthless punitive system like the USA where it's 3 strikes and you're out, we'll throw the key away. But equally, we haven't got a system that's geared to perhaps less punitive measures and more geared to effective rehabilitation. And we need to have one or the other. I think the Commissioner will be challenged in terms of trying to influence that debate. So to conclude, I think the new Commissioner will need a list of skills and qualities as long as you're armed, but the ones that stand out for me in terms of the qualities of the individual will be the need to communicate extremely effectively, not just with the people in the organisation that that individual needs to inspire to do a very difficult and demanding job, but also to the people of London, and indeed to be able to feel free to enter debates about law and order and justice without fear of being branded as speaking from a political point of view. Secondly, live the values of policing. Policing is an intensely vocational occupation. People join for very deep reasons, and they recognise those values, and it's important for the leadership to not just talk them but walk them. Connection with the front line and empathy with the front line of the organisation is important, because a police officer's lot, as you've heard, is often not a happy one. It is a tough and challenging job, and that moral courage and tenacity to be able to drive through the changes that the Metropolitan Police needs in the 21st century.
Okay, last one, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed. Like many of you, I have to mention been to hundreds of these dues about the London Police over the years. There was a great privilege to have present not just people shooting their mouths off, people who've actually experienced it, former Home Secretaries, former Commissioners of Police and so on. They're always wise and shrewd and full of good ideas and constructive. The trouble is they've left their jobs behind. I sometimes crave to have today's Home Secretary, today's Commissioner of Police, so you get teeth into them, rather than those who gain the wisdom of past experience. The only thing I'd like to say is just 2 points. One is, I think policing London is essentially built around a paradox. There are not two police forces, there are two attitudes of mind to the London police. Where we're standing now, within about 200 yards, you probably find 200 policemen. Most of them armed to the teeth, probably one of them listening at the back, frankly in a context where there is absolutely no crime. What the hell are they doing there? The answer is, they're there because politicians feel comfortable to have them there. You go up to Camden Town on Tube Station, you'd be lucky to find 10 policemen within 200 yards, where the place is stuffed with crime. The reason why there are only 10 policemen in Camden Town is politicians aren't the slightest bit interested in what happens in Camden Town. They care about security in Westminster. These two police forces, one is a top-down police force. It's a force which, for the past half century really, has been progressively centralised on the Home Office. Jackie says she's freed police from so many targets and bureaucracy and so on. A good friend of mine is a police constable, was a police constable under Jackie. And sure as hell she felt she was under Jackie, not under the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And when she was complaining about coming into the office, every day we'd sit down and the station sergeant or everyone read out the list of targets they were going to be addressing in whatever operation had been handed down for that particular week. I remember saying that the Home Secretary has abolished all the targets. You've just got to get on with people. She just said, pull the other one. The entire organisation was instinctively gripped by the target culture, and as far as I'm concerned, still is. The consequence of that is a police force which is essentially top-down organised in units that respond to political requirements like knife crime, riot control, whatever it might be, equipped to the teeth with stab vests, cars, motorbikes, helicopters, increasingly guns. Guns in the most ludicrous. I've got guns in Kensington High Street outside my house. Why are there guns in Kensington High Street? God knows. Machine guns. You go into Parliament now, there's two guys with a machine gun pointing at you as they search you. No other country in the world, not just the Western world, has such an armed force with such ferocious weaponry on display in public. Presumably just terrifying people, I don't know. Then there's a totally different police force, which is really the police force that most people always say they want, which is somebody in the street to reassure them. The somebody in the street to reassure them has been derided by 50 years of Metropolitan policemen, but they don't understand crime. Modern crime is high-tech. Modern crime requires data banks, computers, fast cars and response times. I don't think many people feel more reassured when they hear a screaming car down the high street yet again, going in response, usually 5 or 6 cars in response to the same crime. It is not responsive policing to those people who want it. And I think there's now a real clash between these two sorts of polices. And the reason why I rather like the idea of Bill Bratton, coming to the point, is the reason why the police is as it is now in London is because it is essentially a very traditional Freemasonry of policemen. The sergeants are immensely important. They rule a constable's life. Above the sergeants, the commissioners are immensely important, answerable upwards to the Home Secretary or to the culture of the Met. It's a very tight culture. It is no longer sexist or racist, as it certainly used to be. But at the same time, it's very tight. It's a group of people very loyal to each other, very resistant to outsiders. You saw that during the riots. I mean, they don't like the idea of politicians being involved. They may say, what on earth Cobra thought he could do during the riots? I do not know. But people raced back from holiday to try and sort out the high street in Croydon. I mean, it was the ultimate absurdity of centralised policing. But you have got, I think, this tension between the two sorts of policing, which I think Bratton, who I do not know personally, but I've read an awful lot about him, the man has got absolutely no sense of humour. He is not a bundle of laughs. He's weird. He's vain. He never stops talking about himself. Everything about him was not suited to what might be called a nice West End dinner party. On the other hand, he was clearly a bloody effective policeman. And one of the reasons was that he said policing starts on the street. It starts with the silliest little crimes, misdemeanors, what we call ASBOs, and it builds up from that. If you start there, the police get remoralised and people have confidence in the police and help the police. I wonder how many people in Croydon were helping the police that first night. There's been a real break between the people of London and their police force, and it's got to be re-established. And I think Bratton, for all his faults, and I know this is now off the agenda, Bratton's a kind of guy who simply goes down onto the streets and says, right, we're going to get the street sorted out. Get the street sorted out, you get the neighbourhood sorted out, get the neighbourhood sorted out, you get the city sorted out. But until you start with the street, you won't be there. I think Bratton could have done it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks everyone on the panel. That was lots of food for thought. So we are now going to spend the next 25 minutes in free exchange with the panel members. So questions from the floor, please, on any or all those issues or others. So say your name, who you are, where you're from, and direct your question if you need to the person, or I can bring them all in. Okay, first in the front.
Jeremy Thomas, interested spectator. Taking all of the contributions of the panel as a whole, how far do they believe that there is a case for an explicit separation of the local roles and duties of the Metropolitan Police with the national ones? I'm thinking here of the example of Berlin, where I spent some time over in my life, where there is the Berlin police, through the police president, responsible to the government there. And on the other hand, thinking of Sir Simon's reference to guards on government buildings, there's also the Federal Frontier Service, which takes care of some of the more robust roles of law enforcement, both in the city and in other parts of the country, and also does frontier control. How far is that awry? How far might German experience be something to guide to a British problem in that responsibility for law enforcement is shared between national and local authorities, as it is here, but in a different way as it is not in France?
Anyone
I'll take it, but I'll start by saying I haven't quite made my mind up yet. I think you have exactly identified there is a big opportunity, there was a big opportunity with the development of the National Crime Agency to take that, both the counter-terror responsibility and the national investigation responsibility, and shift it there. I think there would have been, for the reasons that you've outlined, quite considerable advantages in doing that potentially. I think it would have meant that some of that split of accountability and pressure that comes onto the Commissioner could have been mitigated, because it would then have been much clearer that the accountability for policing in London was to the Mayor, and the National Crime Agency would deal, if you like, with those national issues and have responsibility to the Home Secretary. However, I think there are probably three difficulties with that. Firstly, I know from experience that the clarity with which you can explain a distinction of responsibilities like that, and the ease with which you feel it's possible to create those new agencies, doesn't exist in reality. And there will always, in real life, be a crossover between things that you might think are going to be responsibility of the National Crime Agency, but would actually be absolutely bread and butter work for a London police force, whoever it was. Secondly, I do think that with the Olympics coming up, that type of reorganisation at this point in time would have been incredibly difficult, which is why I suspect, if it was on the government's agenda, the fact that they're now having to find a new commissioner now is extremely bad news, because the perfect time to do it, of course, would have been after the Olympics, with the ability to look carefully at the reform and with a new commissioner appointed to do that particular work.
I'll just make the contribution that I think the NCA is or was a great opportunity to perhaps address that question. I do think we're a nation of fudge-makers in a sense, because I fear we're not going to grasp that particular nettle. From my own professional experience, the one thing I would say is I've not ever seen a perfect model. I've been to many jurisdictions around the world. One of the benefits of the existing model of connected policing from top to bottom, where all the functions sit within the police service, is that with my responsibility for counter-terrorism, I was literally connected directly through the whole of the police service. So if I wanted the police on the back streets of Burnley to do something differently, that could be done literally immediately. I also could mobilise the whole of the Metropolitan Police, if necessary, in extremis around counter-terrorism issues. I think once you take the command out of the Met and out of the police service, so it's remote, but then you're relying on police resources, you bring a disconnect that I think has some significant implications.
Okay, here.
It's Gibbs from ITV News. There are rumours, and there are any rumours out of Scotland Yard, that they will take a much more restricted approach to relations between police officers and journalists in future. If you were the new commissioner, what policy would you introduce, and what are your concerns about that?
Well, unless I'm wrong, I would assume it was probably never lawful to pay police officers for information, so just enforce the law, I would have thought, and then allow police officers to talk to journalists when it's appropriate. But I mean, the payment was the problem. Hard to see how, if the payments weren't made, it would be possible to stop police officers talking to journalists from time to time, and frankly, for good policing, that would be appropriate.
What about a policy of only having police officers speak to journalists with a press officer present or a press officer approved?
I mean, let's get real. When I was a young reporter on the Evening Standard a long, long while ago, on a Friday night at the news desk, all the brown envelopes were in a row. The PC49 Stoke Newington, PC32 South London. There's a payment. That's what happened. It happens in every country, I imagine. It used to be small beer. It's a part of the sort of lubricant of information. It helped journalists before a case came up in court. Helped the police to get a story out, to get a story out. You can be high and mighty about this, but it's just going to go on. Keep it out of the newspapers.
What I think is interesting is that there's two elements to that, three probably elements to the contact. Two of which I think need a lot more constraints, and one of which probably needs to be encouraged. So what Simon was talking about, if that does still happen, it's wholly wrong, it shouldn't happen, and there is no excuse for it.
Jackie, you know the police, you know the pizza bar in Warwick where it happens every weekend, and if you don't, you're not willing to.
I don't hang out on Warwick every weekend.
No, but I mean there's so much hypocrisy on this subject. It really is.
No, I'm not being. I don't think that's hypocrisy. That's me. I'm not being hypocritical. I'm saying that's wholly wrong. It shouldn't happen. One. Secondly, however, you don't. If I bang on about building confidence and getting people to work alongside the police. Well, I don't think you're able to do that unless you have got the media who understand the nature of what the job is that you're trying to do, that understand the details of the inquiries and investigations that you're involved in. So there has to be, and there should be, an excuse for policing if there are strong relationships and structures through which it's possible for police officers to give the background, to give the details that journalists and the media need in order to help to respond to particular challenges, to understand where the police are coming from, to know what the public needs to do in order to help to solve crimes. But the third area, and that I think should be developed, if anything, the third area though is, and this is exactly the same problem for senior politicians with respect to some journalists. If you are a senior politician, a senior Met Police officer, or a newspaper editor stroke executive, you are part of an establishment that meets together, that drinks together, that dines together, that has parties together. That, as we have seen, I think, over recent months, has got to an extent that I suspect is probably unhealthy for each of the three elements of it. And that's where I think you need to insert more transparency. I think possibly there is an argument for senior police officers, if they're meeting with journalists, to have a press officer or somebody there present, so that everybody's clear about what's being discussed, they know it's above board, that communication that I think is important can take place, but there's no suggestion that this is a dangerously cosy relationship that it's bad for people.
Yes, I'd just contribute that 10 or 12 years ago, as the head of counter-corruption in the Met, we saw through a range of intelligence sources a very small minority of journalists and police officers interacting corruptly, where police officers will be paid to leak information. Now that's corrupt, it's criminal, it's dangerous to public safety in some respects, and the Met tried to take that on and had some modicum of success, but corrupt relationships are hidden, they're very difficult to penetrate, they're very difficult to prove. But the Met, I think, has known for quite a long time that the media, or parts of it, are under huge commercial pressures that drive behaviours that can be completely inappropriate as far as the police are concerned. The police occupy a very important role in our democracy, and at any time can be called upon to investigate any other part of that establishment. And therefore, they have to recognise that with that comes an enormous obligation of transparency and accountability. And therefore, I do think the Metropolitan Police need to look carefully at those rules and recognise how reliant they are on the assistance and help of the press and good relations and communications, because they have an important function in that democracy. And I think the rules actually are pretty good. We just need to make sure people follow them.
Simon, I'll come in there. Are you making a distinction between payments to police officers and treating? The pizza bar is recruiting, which itself is regarded in the police as unethical, but people know it happens at that low level.
It's swinging in money. But I mean, to take a case like that, that's a case in Bristol where the architect one was murdered. I mean, the relationship between the press and the police there was so intense. I mean, you're right, the press is under pressure, but so are the police. And the police were using the press to imply that they got, in effect, they got the man. And a gross injustice was done. The behaviour of the press was, to my mind, utterly unethical and outrageous, but so was the behaviour of the police. What I'm trying to say is that there's obviously a case with better control over it and greater transparency. But as Conrad said, we're all swimming in the same sea. And you'll never get rid of this particular relationship.
Okay. Question from Mark.
Mark Bailey, King's College Law Studies. Just a quick mention of the need for reform of the structures made in parallel with the armed forces. However, the armed forces have reduced immensely their reach and impact, although they get a bigger bang for a single park in one place. Whereas, as you mentioned, we are in the top or second highest level of crime, of contact crime in the Western world. And there seems to be some consensus we need more boots on the ground, which is the reverse of the armed forces thing. So my question to Mr. Quick or anyone is, is this not the central paradox around the budget cuts versus the desperate need for more boots on the ground? Whether you call that community policing or any fancy terms, it's obvious on the beat.
Well, actually, I recognise your observations and agree with it enormously. What I would say is, I think we've a large number of police officers in the country, about 140,000. But you need to ask yourself, what are they doing? And would we rather have 100,000 officers doing what we really want them to do almost all of their time, or 143,000 officers doing what we really want them to do perhaps only 60% or 50% of their time? I think there are clear lessons to be drawn from other parts of our economy, other sectors, including the armed services, local government and health, that can translate into policing and can help deliver that bigger bang for the buck, to make the workforce more productive through the use of new enterprise architectures, new systems, processes, technologies, and empower frontline officers. Simon made the remark about this top-down driven organisation. Actually, it's people where the rubber hits the road, at the front line, where the big decisions actually get made. And in a way, we need to turn the organisation on its head. But do they all need to be police officers? And that's the paradox. A few days ago, London had to turn out 16,000 staff with the power of warrant to maintain law and order. I don't know whether that was too many or too few, but that is an extremely inhibiting feature when you're asking the police to deliver the type of cuts that they're being asked to deliver now?
Well, I just, from this position, I'd like to ask Bob, I mean, is it, with the former Home Secretary sitting next to me, I mean, I've always got the impression when a former Home Secretary goes to the Police Federation conference to be slow hand clapped, that it's quite difficult.
Lucky to get a hand.
Well, right. I mean, whether it's possible to make the kind of management changes you're suggesting without the kind of frankly, sort of cattle prod approach that Simon's suggesting might be brought in by somebody from the outside.
I think it is possible to make the change. In a diffused system of accountability, you actually have to have a consensus to deliver that, and I don't think we've had it. I think the officer number issue has been so politically sensitive for so long because police officers and policing is quite deeply embedded in the psyche of the public, and that's a good thing. But it's been very difficult to move the organisation forward in reform terms because building a consensus across a very complex tripartite system of accountability, governance and decision making is an enormous challenge. But I certainly am one that believes, and I said this, Simon, as a serving Chief Constable, that the police can modernise, they can deliver a bigger bang for the buck by making intelligent reforms, learning from the experience of other parts of our economy, and they could have a more productive, more focused workforce, but it's not entirely within the gift of chief officers. You know, government have a role, the public have a role. If we want to see better value for money from policing, then there has to be some give and take, and we have to move forward cautiously.
When Richard Branson set up Virgin Airways, I think I'm right in saying, he made every member of staff, as they came into work, spend an hour on the check-in desk before they got up to their office, just to learn what it was like to be at the front line. I've always thought every policeman should spend an hour on the beat before he goes to his office job. As it is now, the famous case a few years ago, when a policeman sued the Metropolitan Police for stress, for forcing him to leave his office and go out on the motorbike. I mean, and won. I mean, you're dealing with a seriously dysfunctional local police force in London at the moment. It needs very, very strong leadership.
Okay, a question from the back there.
Yes, good afternoon, Derek Barnes, President of the Police Superintendents Association. I'd just like to reassure Simon Jenkins from the outset that I'm neither part of a Masonic conspiracy, a member of the Metropolitan Police, or indeed a member of a trade union, and sadly never once been offered a brown envelope. I really just two things there. First of all, there's a paradox about what you said about Bill Bratton. And unlike yourself, I have met Bill Bratton, and he's a very eminent police leader. But there is a paradox when you talk about armed police officers in Westminster, and you talk about the performance culture about targets. Bill Bratton is a firm believer in introduced CompStat, which is about target-driven policing and unremitting concentration on targets. So that's the sort of thing that Mr. Bratton would be bringing. And the second one is the paradox about armed police. Every single police officer in New York is bristling with firearms, with tear gas and with batons. And I think just again, clearly, you either want firearms or you don't. My second point really is to invite the panel really, because I've heard of all the difficulties and challenges going to face the new commission, but very little about what may face the commission that will help him in the new job. And perhaps as a start of 10, you might want to talk about the record levels of public support from the Metropolitan Police following the riots, and the outpouring of goodwill towards the police in London. And perhaps also about the very professional, dedicated and wholly ethical police service as well, and the lowest level of homicide in most developed capitals in the Western world. I just wondered if there was something positive you might wish to say to the new...
I'm not going to answer that question, but I am just wondering, the thing about CompStat, whatever you think about it, and in a sense the debate about CompStat has moved on, it wasn't a target system, it was a system for measuring what was happening, which was broadly trusted, it was data. No New York Police Commissioner set targets for crime to reduce, they simply published the statistics with the common sense assumption, on balance it would be better if it went down. Not quite the same as the targets. I just honestly think there's a difference between targets and data.
that was the point that, you know, that I completely agree with Tony, but actually one of the problems I think that happens is that quite rightly, local police leaders use that data in the way in which Bill Bratton did to challenge and to highlight what's happening. And to be honest, if you're on the receiving end of that, that may well feel like a target to you. And that's why I completely understand Simon's point, that whilst I can justifiably say there was only one national target for policing, I know that if you were on the front line, it felt like because you were being held to account on the basis of, quite rightly, on the basis of a quite rich set of data about what was happening where and what was happening day in, day out, that you felt like there were targets. So perhaps, you know, between us we should have done more to distinguish the difference between the correct use of data to focus your efforts and those things that are driven centrally, for which perhaps there wasn't very much legitimacy. I'm perfectly happy to say that I think the person who takes over as Met Commissioner on Monday has a lot, is taking over a fantastic job, where I think you're right that on the whole in this country, the public have a very high level of regard for policing. Over the last few years, confidence in policing has risen, crime levels have fallen, and that is because of the extremely hard work of police officers across London, and it's leadership of them and the staff who support them and people in London that I think would be is the reason for the applications that did actually emerge for that particular job. I would just say though, I do sort of feel that the riots made some people just think again slightly about their feeling, their belief, which they, one of them is probably the confidence that they had before that made them think about this. The confidence that people felt that you picked up the phone when police officers came was slightly rocked by what happened during the riots, and that's why I think there is a job there for the new commissioner to do, to rebuild.
Simon, anything positive to say?
The most positive thing the new commissioner could achieve, which the last three have told me personally they would like to have achieved, is to stop the nonsense whereby every policeman has to patrol in pairs. I mean, that's a health and safety, trade union requirement now, and of course it halves the number of policemen you get on the streets. And when you see, sorry?
It's not health and safety.
Well, it was described as such, safety anyway. But the psychological approach to a single policeman or woman is, I want to help them. And that particular constable wants help. In other words, when they talk to people, they talk to members of the public. Two together talk to each other. And instinctively, you feel less inclined to help them. Now, all policemen I've spoken to all around the world always say that. In London, not invariably, but almost everywhere they patrol in pairs now. It is not necessary.
Just on that,
you could help on this.
In our recent report, we did look at this issue. The single patrolling that Sir Paul Stevenson tried to introduce is actually ACPO policy. It's what they think should happen by default. We asked people, including a breakdown in London, what's the more common sight when you do see a police officer in your neighbourhood? And 80% said walking together in pairs. Around the country it's actually a majority, but it's not that high. So whatever the policy is, it's not happening on the ground. So John,
yeah. Thank you. Well, a bit like a 50-pence piece, I'm a bit seven-sided with my experiences, because I've been a security minister, I've been chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I've been a finance minister, I've been chairman of 2 police authorities. I could go on. So I know one or two things about it. But a comment on Bill Bratton. When Bill Bratton took over in New York, he had the support of the mayor, and he was able to amalgamate the New York City Police, the New York Housing Department Police, and the New York Transport Department Police, and that made a big difference. Of course, he was also supported by the DEA, the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, and several other national bodies. So when we try and compare the UK with America or continental Europe, we're not comparing like with like. Very different systems of accountability. Whoever becomes the next commissioner of the Metropolitan Police next week has to deal with this. This is the overriding problem. my finance minister role. We live in a global economy where there is going to be no more money. And for the next 4 years, 20% reduction in police budget has to be achieved. How is this to be done? Who is to lead that? Is it the Commissioner? Is it the elected Mayor? Or the Mayor to be elected in 2012? What is to be done about the huge structure of the Metropolitan Police? Does it need 10 ranks above the rank of constable to manage its resources? Does it need 32 borough commands or a whole galaxy of people in the rank of chief superintendent down? How is this huge structure to be managed and reformed if that reduction in expenditure is to be achieved without damaging the number of constables and sergeants and perhaps inspectors that you have, because they're the people that make the police service work at the end of the day? Who's going to lead on that? The new Commissioner or the Mayor? Which one's going to do it?
What have you worked aside? How do you get more for less? Is it okay for the Mayor to get a grip of the management without the Commissioner, the Chiefs, thinking it overrides their operational independence?
I think clearly the Mayor has a role. The police are accountable. They will be challenged and should be challenged about their use of resources. I think the Commissioner and his top team will be very well qualified to understand the impacts of reductions in resources and where they will be least felt and where capability needs to be protected against the profile of risks and demands the organisation faces. So I do see it as a process led by practitioners, accountable to politicians and the public. I do believe the Metropolitan Police actually has got a good track record of taking costs out of the business and improving its overall effectiveness. But it is hugely challenged right now by the scale and the speed of these cuts. They're rising to the challenge, I think. I'm sure they're looking at management on costs and structures and the whole gambit of costs in the organisation. But I think the more the service can empower the front line of the organisation, the less management overheads you require. But that's a cultural change. It's a change about the way we recruit, train and develop personnel. It's a change about how we use information and deliver it to the front line to be able to make the right decisions to protect the public. So these changes actually can't happen overnight. But I do believe it should be led by the Commissioner.
Okay, we're getting close to the end. There was a number of questions submitted on Twitter. I've chosen one of the better ones, less abusive one. I'm used to abuse on Twitter. This is a question perhaps for everyone. And it goes to some of the issues about the national and the local. Has the Met job become too big for one person? Jackie, you were in the Labour government when the Prime Minister decided that was true of the Home Secretary's job and created a whole new department. 52,000 is a huge number of people. Is the job of being Met Commissioner too big for one person?
I think this really goes back to the first question. Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. Assuming that the structure around them, the people to whom they have to report, the resources that they have to do the job, the public support is all in place.
I mean, the Met has existed since 1829 as a single institution. I think to break up London's local police force would be a long thing to do. Transport for London is probably bigger as a single institution. It too has a commissioner. So I think it isn't too big. I mean, intriguingly, in Scotland as we speak, they're about to create a single police force for 5 million people. A piece of localism from the Scottish government. So, I think though there is a tendency to move to other bigger institutions, if it's done well, it could be done.
Simon, any prospect of your London police service?
No, I agree with what's been said. One thing I just know, the police are not short of money in London. I mean, they are tripping with money. They've got any kit they want, helicopters in the air all the time of their life. Someone breaks into your car, 2 people come round to interview you for victim support. 2 professional policemen. Extraordinary organisation, policemen. They just need an admin doctor.
Okay,
take the job.
We're running out of time. I think we'll probably have to wrap it up there. Just for topicality, you don't have to say who you'd like, but who on the panel would you tip to be the next commissioner this time? It's not going to be Mr. Bradley.
I'm not willing to do it on the basis that it might put a black spot on somebody, but I have written it down.
You mentioned Bernard earlier. Tony?
Tim Godwell. Impossible. It's an absolutely impossible thing to judge because we're so far removed from the way how these decisions are made. I mean, clearly, all 4 of them have got recent London experience, so it's not going to be an outsider. It'll be a London insider to some extent who gets the job because that's the practice. So I just sidestepped my answer, sorry about that.
Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming and really thank you.